Today we're going to be discussing what clamp max and clamp grad actually do, and they're related to this broader concept called guidance that we'll be exploring today. Guidance is also related to latent scale schedule, as well as init scale schedule, sat scale, clip guidance scale, and more of these sort of scale parameters. The great news is that broadly, once you understand what guidance is and what it's doing, what each of these individual parameters is doing becomes much more intuitive. Okay, so this is a long video and it's kind of complicated. You have to understand what's going on, and then we do a bunch of experiments. So let me first just tell you like the most practical thing you could know. Basically, you have a bunch of different types of guidance, and usually they have the word scale, like clip guidance scale, latent scale, init scale, sat scale, deflicker scale, deflicker latent scale. And all of these are basically, at every step, they're pulling the image that WarpFusion generates towards something. So clip guidance scale is pulling the image that WarpFusion generates towards a text prompt. Latent, or like deflicker scale is pulling the image towards less flickering. Latent scale is pulling the image towards sort of like vaguely how it looked at the beginning of the generation. And so the numbers that you put here are how much the image is getting pulled in each of those directions. Now, sometimes what will happen is you'll put in a value like 1000 for clip guidance scale, and you'll find that like your video just looks super weird. It has artifacts everywhere. And if that's the case, then you should go and use the setting called clamp grad. You should make sure it's on. What clamp grad is saying is, hey, when you have all of the guidance sort of added together, like make sure it's not more than some amount. So a reasonable value here would be like 0.5. And basically what that's going to do is it's going to say, hey, even if, clip guidance would have like pulled the image way out of proportion, you had like a huge number there, so it's really influential, the maximum it's allowed to move is 0.5. So basically, if you want your image to be like more guided by, for example, the text prompt, you could set this value to be higher, or if you want it to be more like the initial latents, you can set this value to be higher. And then if you set them so high that you're starting to get like weird problems or there's like artifacts or glitching, then you can set clamp max to be something lower. I believe its default value is 2, but 0.5 works pretty well for me. Okay, with that, now let's sort of get into a more detailed view of what's going on. We can think about the theory here. So let's quickly talk about the theory behind these scaling settings so we know what to expect when we're playing with WarpFusion. So let's say that WarpFusion wants to generate a frame that looks like this. It's just like a guy with his hands up. What each of these settings do is they apply a little bit of guidance in a direction away from this frame. So for example, why don't we use like init latent scale and clip scale for our example. So what init latent scale does is it pulls this image back to what it looked like in the first frame. So let's say that in the first frame, this guy actually had one hand up and one hand down. So init latent scale is basically going to grab this image and nudge it back towards that. And what clip scale is going to do is it's going to pull the image towards the text description. So let's say that the text description was sunny man, then the clip scale is going to want to pull the image towards something, with like kind of an obvious sun in the corner. And so sat scale would usually pull the image towards a given saturation, but it's actually broken right now. FFT scale deals with some sort of high frequency noise, but that doesn't get exposed, so you don't have to worry about it. Basically, there's a bunch of different directions that this image could get pulled in. And so once we have these main directions, again, here is latent scale. You might think, which of these are we going to add? Are we going to go this way? Are we going to go this way? And the answer is we add them together. So in this case, our final direction will sort of be this way. And probably what that is going to look like is going to be a guy with one arm up and one arm down and a bit of sun going on. Okay, so you might think, each of these things is not just like yes or no, right? It's a number. And what the number is controlling is how long these arrows are. So for example, if clip scale is really small, then this arrow is only going to point sort of like this. And then when you add this arrow and this arrow, the arrow you're going to get is going to point like mostly here. And you're going to get an image which, it has like a little bit more sun, but mostly it's just the guy with his hand shifted. On the other hand, if clip scale is really large, what's going to happen is that, this arrow is going to be huge. And when you add these arrows together, you're going to get an arrow that's like all the way up here. And it's going to be a super sunny, image with the guy's arms sort of offset. So, whoops. Okay, so now let's talk about how clamp max and clamp grad fit into this picture. Basically, if your arrows start to get too long, like if this red arrow is too long, then the correction from the latents can start to be bigger than like the signal from the model itself. And this causes artifacts. So sometimes what you want to say is, I really only want to take like a little bit of this final direction. Like I want to take a small step towards a world that's like a little bit sunnier and has the guy's hands, a little bit more like how they were originally, but nothing too crazy. And the setting that you use to do that is clamp max. And clamp max literally takes the length of this vector and clamps it to whatever you set clamp max to. So maybe it's like 2 or 3 or something. And then clamp grad just determines whether or not clamp max applies. So if clamp grad is no, then we just don't care about clamp max and we use the red vector as is. If clamp grad is true, then we use the blue vector. Okay, so why don't we try to get some intuition for how these settings actually behave in practice. So I recommend getting the smallest video you can. This video that I'm using, it's 15 FPS, like 512 by 768 or something. It's very small, and that's great because it means we can do experiments really quickly with it and just see what various settings do. So as per usual, we're using the WarpFusion backends. And of course, WarpFusion is made by this guy, Alex. Here's his Patreon. He spent a bunch of time making this technology. It's really cool. And if you like it, especially if you find yourself using the WarpFusion backend, you should support him on Patreon, get in his Discord, talk with everyone else there. There's lots of great stuff. All right, so why don't we first do a run with the default settings and see what our generations look like. Here's the output. In the middle of that run, we actually changed to using the Dreamshaper model, so it looks a little bit better than default Stable Diffusion. This is the clip that we'll be using as a reference for our settings changes. Okay, now let's keep exactly the same settings, but turn clamp max all the way down to 0.00001. So what we're doing here is we're effectively setting the update or like the guidance vector to be 0. We're clamping it to a very small number. And let's see how that affects our generation. And actually, while that runs, why don't we make a new project with some other settings just so we can work more efficiently here. So we'll use the same video. And we'll continue to use Dreamshaper. But this time, let's set latent scale schedule to 0 and 1000. And we'll keep clamp max at its default value of 2. So just to remind you what we're expecting here, it should be that latent scale keeps the image more consistent to how it was in the beginning, even as the video progresses. Okay, and actually, while this runs, why don't we even do it one more time? Again, same video, same model, but this time let's set the clip guidance scale to 1000. Okay, why don't we start diffusing? So it looks like our first run has finished. Here's how it looks. And here's a comparison of it against the default settings. Remember, this is the one where we set clamp max to be a very small number, so there's almost no impact of guidance. All right, so these videos look very similar to me. That's great. It's sort of what you expect. Default doesn't have a huge guidance vector, and then when we clamp that guidance vector to be basically 0, almost nothing changes. All right, and then coming over to look at how our, this is the one with latent scale schedule set to something, and we can see that it's looking a little bit janky. So one possibility for what's going on here is that the clamp, like the vector is too large, it's causing artifacts, and in fact, we should clamp max down to something more like 0.5 maybe. So instead of this kind of like artifacty mess, why don't we stop this and run it again and see how it goes. Okay, great. It looks like our run with latent scale schedule has finished, and as expected, setting the clamp max to 0.5 has completely solved our artifacting problem. Again, this is just because you can imagine that the guidance from 1000 latent was too large, and clamp max is basically cutting the amount of guidance to be much shorter. And let's see, we were running this other one at the same time. This was the one with clip guidance scale 1000, and we can see that in fact, the prompt emphasizes stuff like neon, dystopian, high tech, and the video we got was much more sort of neon and like technical than the last one. Okay, and here they are side by side. So I think the impact of clip scale was extremely clear here. The video is much more neon, it's much more prompt guided. I think latent scale is less clear. I'm guessing if our video were longer and had more time to drift, we would see a clearer sort of pull back towards what it looks like at the beginning. But here, because the video kind of looks the same at the beginning as it does at the end, it's harder to see what exactly it's doing. So there are a few more guidance settings that we didn't have time to get into here, but they work basically similarly. Like deflicker scale and deflicker latent scale are both controlling for flickering loss, for example. Sat scale in theory is helping you out with saturation, but in practice, if you set this to anything other than 0 right now, it causes a black screen, so probably don't use that for now. Anyway, I hope this video helped you really understand the difference between all of these different like scale parameters, what they mean, what they are. I know they look a little bit intimidating, but really once you understand how they interact with clamp max and kind of how you can use clamp max to sort of control any problems that come out of them, I think they feel much friendlier. Once again, if you want to use hydrogen, for example, to do many experiments in parallel like we've done right now, you could just open up 10 tabs, run 10 warps with different settings all at the same time, and we'll just spin up enough GPUs to help you out with that. You can go to hydrogenml.com and join our Discord, and we'll be happy to help you with that. Hope this was useful. Hope you understand more about WarpFusion, and we'll see you next time.